Okay, good afternoon and welcome. I'm Dr. Linda Hayden. I'm chair of the department, and it's probably a good thing that I haven't met a lot of you because usually when I meet a student, there's some kind of a problem going on. So if I haven't met you, that means things are going great, right? So I want to welcome you this afternoon to this event. This is an annual event, and I want to give you a little bit of background about the event first, and then Dr. Palmer will introduce our speaker, Dr. Kazdin, for today. First, I wanted to let everyone know that I'm actually a San Jose State alum, and it was an event similar to this one that kind of influenced me in shifting from what I thought would be a straight clinical master's level degree, which is what my initial plans were, to moving more toward the PhD and moving into research as well as clinical work. And it was because I listened to a speaker who came to campus as Dr. Kazdin is today and realized there's a whole world out there that I just didn't know anything about. And it got me really very excited, very, very excited. And there are a number of people that, as we all need, that mentored me and helped me move along in the direction that I wanted to go. And I landed back here as a professor at San Jose State, and I've been here for 28 years. So I really believe in our having these kinds of events and opportunities for each of us to find out that there is, in fact, a whole world out there. There's a lot of different kinds of research going on, a lot of different directions you can go within the field of psychology. So I welcome you today, and I hope it's a very productive time and interesting, informative time for you. So before we introduce our distinguished speaker today, I would like to share briefly how this lecture series came about. Several years ago, there was a generous endowment to psychology in honor of Dr. Alan Kazdin. Some of you have probably read some of the things that he's done in your textbooks. He's a leader in the field of behavioral psychology particularly, and the endowment that was given to our department was designed to support opportunities like today, to have opportunities for distinguished lectures and opportunities for students to gain experience and exposure to a range of areas within our discipline. Dr. Alan Kazdin's accomplishments are many. He is the Sterling Professor of Psychology and Child Psychiatry at Yale University, currently has been for a number of decades, and he is the director of the Yale Parenting Center, where thousands of families have been helped by the scientifically driven parenting techniques he teaches parents who have kids with behavioral problems. He's done a remarkable work there along with his colleagues. Throughout his decades-long career, he has led clinical research groups in the study of developmental psychopathology and best practice for treatment of children and adolescents. His contributions to the field have been very extensive, and that really is to say the least. Excuse me, with over 700 publications on cognitive behavioral treatment, parenting, interventions for children and adolescents, and methodology and research design. He also served as the editor of 6 major journals in psychology and as president of the American Psychological Association. What is equally important to all of these contributions and accomplishments, Dr. Kazdin is an alum of our program. He graduated from San Jose State University, and he has very fond memories of his time here and wanted to contribute and to give back to the students so that they would have an equally informative and developmental experience while here. He worked very closely when he was here with Dr. Tom Tutko, who is no longer, he retired quite a long time ago. Dr. Tutko was also one of my mentors, so I'm certainly very familiar with how much fun it was to have him as a faculty sponsor. He described his professors here as remarkable and life-changing, and he believes in setting the stage and providing as many opportunities for students to develop in the direction that they dream about as much as possible. We're grateful for the support he's shown to his alma mater, and And in addition to thanking him, I want to thank a couple of pretty significant people who made this happen. First of all, Dr. Evan Palmer, who is the faculty coordinator for this event, and I appreciate all of his hard work. And it definitely wouldn't have come together without Ellen Peterson, one of our wonderful staff in our department office. We don't know where we'd be without our department staff, including Nani Nguyen, as well as Ellen. And so I thank all of them for all the work that they've done.
Good afternoon, everybody. It is my pleasure to welcome and introduce Dr. Laura Carstensen today as this year's speaker for the Alan E. Kazdin Endowed Lecture in Psychology. Dr. Carstensen is a professor of psychology at the Fairleigh S. Dickinson Jr. Professor of Psychology and the Fairleigh S. Dickinson Jr. Professor in Public Policy at Stanford University. She serves as the founding director of the Stanford Center on Longevity. Her research has been supported continuously by the National Institute on Aging for more than 25 years, and she is currently supported through a prestigious Merit Award. In 2011, she authored the book, A Long, Bright Future, Happiness, Health, and Financial Security in an Age of Increased Longevity. Dr. Carstensen has served on the National Advisory Council on Aging and the MacArthur Foundation's Research Network on an Aging Society. In 2016, she was inducted into the National Academy of Medicine. She has won numerous awards, including the Kleemeyer Award from the Gerontological Society of America and a Guggenheim Fellowship. She received a BS from the University of Rochester and a PhD in clinical psychology from West Virginia University. We were particularly interested to invite Dr. Carstensen to speak because she has a long history of student mentorship. For instance, she won the Distinguished Mentor Award from the Gerontological Society of America, the Dean's Award for Distinguished Teaching at Stanford, and a Master Mentor Award from the American Psychological Association. We are very excited to have her here at San Jose State University to speak to us today. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Laura Carstensen.
Thank you, Evan. What a pleasure it is to be here. I have a number of thank yous. I want to thank Dr. Hayden for the invitation and for coming to meet me on campus and sharing lots of stories about how wonderful you all are. I want to thank Dr. Palmer for that lovely, gracious introduction. Thank you. But also for meeting me in the parking garage and making sure I could find my way here. So this is great. And I want to thank you all for being here on a beautiful afternoon and staying inside a little bit longer to talk about psychology. I want you to know that when I was an undergraduate and a graduate student, I thought of Alan Kazdin as a god. You know, I mean, he could do anything. He published, as you heard, hundreds of papers. He was one of these psychologists that everybody looked up to and aspired to be even a tiny, tiny, tiny bit like. And it never would have crossed my mind ever that I would be giving an Alan Kazdin lecture. So it's a terrific honor for me to be here. And it made me think, as I was reflecting on back when I was an undergraduate, I hope you all take a moment every once in a while and think of these memories that you'll reflect on 30 years from now as you're looking back on your time here. Think of those really precious moments that you can savor for forever. And if you're not thinking of a lot of them, make some so that you can then reflect on them again. So what I want to do this afternoon is to talk to you about aging, to talk to you about longevity. I actually think it's a better way to think of these longer lives we're living as longevity in terms of longevity as opposed to aging. Because aging, first of all, comes with a lot of baggage. People think about it in a certain way. But also having longer lives isn't about any single stage more than any other single stage. It means we have more time in our lives. And that's what we've been presented with at this point in human history. Knowing something about the fine educations you all have, I can make some predictions with fair confidence, and here's one. You're going to sail through your 80s, into your 90s, and many of you in this room will live to be 100 and beyond. There are some scientists, some biodemographers, thinking that in the 21st century, scientific advances may lead to even longer lifespans than we imagined and that we're expecting today. So there are lots of debates going on about how long can humans live, and we don't know the answer to that. What we know now, however, is that people are living longer and longer, and we continue to see these numbers go up. So when the biologists are saying there must be a cap, we can't keep living longer and longer and longer indefinitely, and the biodemographers respond, you look at these numbers, I'm showing you these trends, where do you see it asymptoting? Where is it leveling off? And it's hard to make an argument that we won't live longer. A very distinguished biodemographer recently made predictions for different countries for life expectancy as a function of date of birth. And 2007, now, were any of you born in 2007? Any of you that young? You probably just missed it. You're probably a little bit older than that. Babies born since 2007, the prediction is, will live to be 104 in the United States. So that's just to give you a sense of the kinds of predictions that are now being made from some very serious folks who are studying life expectancy and these trends. And what it means to me is that more important than anything probably is that we begin to look at these little children who are out there, you know, climbing on the play structures and swinging on the tire swings, those little children in elementary school. They are the first centenarians of the 22nd century. So the next time you see them, squint your eyes just a little bit, and you will see very old people in the future. It's our job, I believe, as a scientist, behavioral researcher, to create a world so that when they arrive at 100, they will be happy, they will be healthy, and they'll be financially secure. That's what I believe we need to do now at this point in history. Now, a lot of people, when they think about aging, are pretty grim about it. You know, they're not saying, terrific, you know, we're gonna be really, really old. I didn't see a whole lot of smiles when I told you were going to live to be 100, frankly, as I looked out here in this sea of faces. And I think part of that is because these very long lives are very new in human history. So throughout most of human history, life was short. And I mean really short. So as we were evolving on the African savanna, hundreds, thousands, millions of years ago, life expectancy was somewhere between 18 and 20. We don't know for sure, but that is very short. And in those early days, evolution acted on life expectancy. It acted in the way that evolution acts, and the life expectancy got a little bit longer, a little bit longer, a little bit longer. By the mid-1800s, life expectancy in this country had reached the mid-30s. So I want you to, you're going way back in evolution, slow increases, suddenly it goes to mid-30s. By 1900 in the United States, life expectancy was 47. And by the end of that same century, life expectancy was 77. Today it's 79, and as I say, it's continuing to go up. And so I think some of this concern about aging results from the fact that we suddenly are getting older, and we don't have a long history of that. We don't have a culture that supports us to be 100. In fact, I often argue that much of the problem that we face today with human aging is the fact that culture hasn't caught up with the length of our lives. And so the culture that tells us when to get an education, when to marry, when to have children, when to retire, what to eat, how to exercise, what kind of medicine we access, what kinds of buildings that we build. The culture is a culture that evolved around lives half as long as the ones that we're living today. So we very quickly added more years, more decades to life expectancy, and now our charge is to change the world so that it helps us get all the way through, and to do so happily, healthily, and productively. Now, as I say, you know, this is an incredible gift. It's an incredible cultural achievement, cultural accomplishment that we added these years. Oh, by the way, it has nothing to do with evolution, these extra 30 years in the last century. Evolution doesn't work that fast at all. There's no reason to think that we are genetically different than our ancestors were 10,000 years ago. But instead, what changed are the odds of us making it to old age. So as recently as the 1950s in this country, the population or the age distribution in the population was shaped like a pyramid. And this was true not only for the United States, but for every country in the world. And by the way, most species. And that is, you have a population pyramid. So you have many young ones at the bottom, many born, and many of them die off. And so the age distribution is winnowed to a tiny peak at the top of those people who survive and make it all the way to old age. So we've had these population pyramids. And what has changed over the last 70 years is that the pyramids are being reshaped into rectangles. So think about what that means for a minute. It means that most babies who are being born in the Western world for the first time in human history are having the opportunity to live out their full lives. Spectacular achievement. So why don't we see people dancing in the streets? Yay, we're gonna grow old. We don't see that a lot, but it is 30 extra years. It's more time to realize your goals, to spend with your loved ones, to chase your dreams. You've got more time. And the reason that I believe people are not happy about this, not excited in the way that one day I believe they will be, is because many of our beliefs about old age are wrong. There are scores of myths that surround aging for multiple reasons. Some is because we just don't know much about old age. Some of these myths are because aging itself is a moving target. If we went back 70 years, older people were not faring the way that they are today. There was a paper recently published on cognitive aging, and the title of it was, "These Are Not Your Parents' Test Scores." That is, that we're seeing over historical time that presumed drop we would see in cognitive functioning. For those of you who study cognitive aging, we think that's going to go steadily down. It's not going steadily down quite so much. We've also recently learned that dementia begins to show effects on cognitive function decades before there are symptoms, and that if you remove those people from our studies who go on to eventually get dementia, that cognitive decline is hardly noticeable. So it may be that what we've been doing is conflating a disease with aging and concluding that we see this kind of steady downward course. So that's one example. We're also seeing over historical time rates of dementia decline. And these are big drops. Between the years 2000 and 2014, the prevalence of dementia, the incidence of a dementia in a cohort fell by 24%. Not a lot of good news about Alzheimer's disease, but that's good news, that most people are never going to get it. And that's changing over historical time. We believe that physical health, physical functioning declines gradually over over age. And it looks like that decline is changing so that we still see people decline physically before they die. But in people who have high levels of education, it looks less like a steady decline and more like a stepwise fall off shortly before people die. So we're beginning to see these kinds of changes in the functioning and the resilience of people as they grow old. Now, there's another myth about aging, and that's the one that I'm going to spend my remaining time talking about with you this afternoon. It's a myth that I call the misery myth. It's the myth that older people are despairing, they're sad, they're lonely, they're depressed, they're dejected. And I think it may be one of the most pernicious myths about aging that there is. And the reason is not just that people may not look forward so much to growing older, but what it means is that people don't prepare. So I spend a lot of time with people in the financial services industry, people who want to help people invest more and earlier and so on to prepare for longer lives. And I often hear them talking to clients of theirs saying things like, you really got to save more for healthcare because nursing home costs are really going up. And so you got to put aside more money, And I see people kind of drift off. It's kind of like, don't have fun today because you got to save that money for when you're miserable. And then you'll have enough money to maintain your life as a miserable person. So the problem with viewing old age as a time of misery is not just that it's not true, and that's the punchline of this, it's that it discourages people. It discourages all of us for planning. Why would you plan, especially putting off today, things that you could do later, if you're expecting a time in life to be horrible? So, older people are not more likely to be depressed, to be lonely, to be anxious than younger and middle-aged people are. And if you are surprised by these findings that I'm talking to you about this afternoon, you are not alone. Findings from studies showing that older people are doing well, that they're happy, that they're contented, that they're able to regulate emotions, that we see higher rates of wisdom, greater satisfaction. These findings make headlines in major newspapers. People are shocked. And nobody was more shocked than gerontologists, researchers, who were saying things like, this just can't be true. Maybe people are just making up stories to cover up an otherwise horrible existence. They're trying to make other people feel better. That was one early hypothesis. And then there was a hypothesis that it was masked depression. People were depressed, but they were in denial that they were depressed. And so they were telling the researchers that they were okay. And then there was another alternative offered, this one I call the village idiot explanation. It's that cognitive decline is so steep that older people can't remember what they're miserable about long enough to whip themselves into a really, terrible state. None of those are true. None of those alternatives have borne out to empirical test. And instead, these findings just continue to appear. So these are findings, for example, from a recent Gallup poll where they simply asked people aged 18 to 82, 85, yesterday, how much stress did you experience? You see a steep decline there. How much worry? How much anger? And we see these kinds of declines in negative emotion over and over again in studies that compare people of different ages. And I got to tell you that one of my favorite things to talk about to undergraduates is this finding, these kinds of findings, because people regularly tell you that these are the best years of your life, right? All the time, right? So we see the highest rates of depression, anxiety, loneliness in college student-aged population. And then you got a bunch of old codgers going like me saying, and these are the best years of your life, enjoy them. And it's not true. It's the worst time in your life, emotionally speaking. So there are a lot of good things about being young, but emotional well-being doesn't happen to rank very high. Older people are doing a lot better than younger people are emotionally. Now, you may also have questions about this, and I certainly had questions about it. And one of the questions that my research group had about these kinds of findings is that maybe they really reflected cohort effects, generational effects. So most of these studies are like these Gallup poll studies where they take a lot of people of different ages and compare them at a single point in time. And if that's the case, then it could just be that older people are and always have been the greatest generation. So it could be a cohort effect, not something that you all can anticipate enjoying as you get older, but rather just reflecting some historical change in the well-being of the population. And so my group ran a longitudinal study of emotional experience over about a 15-year time span. We initially recruited a group of people aged 18 to 94. We gave them electronic pagers, and we asked them to carry those pagers with them for a week. And at random times during the day, we would sample them, cue them to tell us the extent to which they were feeling each of 19 different emotions. And we were able then to see age differences cross-sectionally and how people were doing at different ages. But we didn't stop there. We followed the same people over time. So 5 years later, we brought them back to the laboratory, gave them the pagers again, asked them to go out, carry them for a week, and we sampled their emotional experience. 5 years later, we brought them back again, sent them out with the pagers for another week, collected their emotional experience. And by the way, throughout this process, we were recruiting new young people because people aged out of the youngest group. And when the older people we were lost either to illness or mortality, we recruited new older people. And so we ended up with this very broad age range of individuals where we had a 10-plus year span of their emotional well-being. And what you see depicted here in this slide is the positive experience minus the negative experience. And so as these lines go up, it means on balance, people are experiencing more positive emotions in their daily lives. Now, as I said, this is driven mostly from a reduction in negative emotions. But positive emotions stay just as high, and negative emotions go down. So if you're averaging how well people are doing, they're doing better and better emotionally. And these data are within individuals and across multiple cohorts. So it looks like this is a developmental shift where we're seeing improvements in emotional well-being as people grow older. Don't think for a minute that I'm suggesting that aging is a piece of cake, because it's not. A lot goes wrong as people grow older. They lose social status, lose typically loved ones. The older you get, the more likely you are to have lost somebody close to you. They lose physical health in many cases and are suffering from chronic conditions like arthritis, or high cholesterol, high blood pressure. So there are problems that occur as people grow older. We're all counting on you all to solve these problems scientifically, technologically. But we have this, what came to be called paradox. People were suffering losses as they grew older, and they were getting happier. Another observation is that people were interacting less with other people. Older people spend more time alone than younger people do. And we think, well, social relationships what makes people happy. Older people are interacting less and feeling better. And it was called the paradox of aging. And it was this paradox that my colleagues and I studied and continue to study really now for many years to try to understand what could be the mechanisms underpinning this improvement in emotional well-being as people grow old. So, to make a very long story a little bit shorter, we developed a theory called socio-emotional selectivity theory, and it's a theory that is grounded in the uniquely human ability to monitor time. Now, I don't mean clock time and calendar time. Other species can monitor time in that way, too. You can't have reinforcement learning without some sense of time. But to our knowledge, humans are the only species that can anticipate our own mortality throughout most of our lives. So everybody in this room knows that we're not going to live forever. And we also know, roughly, or we can make a good guess, about how much time we've got left. And you all have more time left in your estimations and my estimations of you than I have. And it doesn't make me miserable, by the way. When people think it's tomorrow, there's not a lot of happiness. But when you're just moving through life, we tend to begin to perceive some constraints on time. And because goals are always set in temporal context, that is, you can't set a goal outside of a temporal context. So goals are always set temporally. Temporality changes with age, time horizons, and that results in goals changing systematically with age. According to socio-emotional selectivity theory, it's not about age in the sense of how many years it's been since you were born. It's about time left. It's about how many years you have left. And that shifts systematically as people grow older. People are good at making these estimations. Lots of data support that. And when people perceive longer futures, they set different kinds of goals in everyday life than when they set have shorter time horizons. And here's what looks like happens. When people are young and or they perceive their futures as essentially limitless, just having all the time in the world, what happens is that people are in a motivational state to collect, to explore the world, to meet new people, to acquire new facts, to learn about others. And this kind of an exploration mode is very good for learning. And as it turns out, learning is hard. And taking risks is hard. And it often entails negative emotions, along with being highly adaptive. So as people collect, take chances, explore, emotional health and emotional life is more risky than when they don't. You can get young people to go on blind dates. You go out, you meet somebody, you spend a little time with them. I've talked to undergraduates at Stanford who've actually said, I was dating this fellow because I really didn't like him. And I said, huh? I said, well, I wanted to find out why. Okay. People in their 60s don't do that, trust me. It's like, but if you feel like you've got all the time left, why not explore? Why not take a chance? Why not do these kinds of things, even if you think you don't like them? I often also say it's hard to get people in their 80s to take inorganic chemistry. But it's easy to get people in college to do that. Why? For most people, and I don't want to insult any chemists here in this room, I'm sure there are some who just love it. But for most people, they're taking this course because it'll open a door so that they can do something else. So it's a banking function. Younger people engage in lots and lots of behaviors they may not want to engage in because they might get something out of it later. FOMO, the new disorder, right? The fear of missing out. Again, old people, we don't have that. But you'll hear young people say, I want to go to that party. Why? I don't really want to go, but I'm going to go because I kind of want to be there. Really? Those are the kinds of goals that people set when they have all the time in the world. And what happens is people come to perceive time as constrained. They perceive time as in some way limited. Goals change. They change systematically, and they change in ways that favor how people feel over what people can acquire or what they can learn. And we say, theoretically, that this is because those goals are realized in the very doing. So if I talk to you because I love talking to you, it makes me feel good, that's a different kind of goal than if I'm going to talk to you because you know something I need to learn. Right? And so what we see is this kind of shift with a preference for feeling good, engaging in not just happy things and events, but meaningful kinds of interactions that matter. with family, interactions that are related to a cause that people feel passionately about, or work products that they really care about, employment that they really care about. So you see these kinds of changes unfold across adulthood. We don't think it's related to age, we think it's related to time. So one of the first things that my group needed to do as we were developing this theory and arguing that it's time, not so much age, was to see if we could disentangle age from time. And we developed an experimental paradigm that we have now run many, many, many times with lots of different samples in different countries. And it's very simple. We just ask people how they would allocate their time if they had 30 minutes free. And what we do is we set it up like this. We say, I want you to imagine you've got 30 minutes free, no pressing commitments. The following 3 people are available to you. With whom would you like to spend that 30 minutes? And we did a lot of research to identify the different types of social partners that represented different types of goals. So one of the options is a member of your immediate family or a close friend. For most people, those are emotionally meaningful, even if they're not positive, but they're emotionally meaningful, right? Member of your family. Another option is the author of a book you just read. For many people, that's information, but it's not necessarily making you feel emotionally, important. And another was a recent acquaintance with whom you seem to have much in common. And we selected that one because that's all about the future. It's all about maybe this person will become a good friend, but in the future. So we say, imagine you've got 30 minutes free, following 3 people are available to you. A member of your immediate family. You're going to tell me what you say to this, so pay attention. A member of your immediate family, the author of a book you've just read, a recent acquaintance with whom you seem to have much in common. Raise your hand if you'd spend that time with a member of your immediate family. Okay. The author of a book you just read. Okay. A recent acquaintance with whom you seem to have much in common. Okay, that's about what we find. So what we see with younger people is that those responses are relatively evenly distributed across the 3 different types of goals. So these people represent different types of goals. We ask older people that same question. Overwhelmingly, they say a member of their immediate family. Very few are saying they want to spend time with the author or a recent acquaintance. They're going to focus on meaningful social partners. We thought, okay, we've shown that we see these age differences. Now comes the time part. So we said again to a younger sample, I want you to imagine that you're about to move across country. You're going by yourself without family or friends, but you find yourself in the middle of packing with 30 minutes free and the following 3 people are available to you. Who do you choose? How many would spend time with a close friend or member of your immediate family? Okay. The author of a book you just read? A recent acquaintance with whom you seem to have much in common. There you go. I turned you into old people. That's the response. Younger people now, their responses were indistinguishable from what older people say, under time constraints. And we weren't telling them they're going to die. We weren't telling them they were old. We just said they were going to move. But when time is constricted, goals change. And we saw that we could get younger people with a very simple instruction about time to shift their responses to ones that resembled very elderly people. We thought, wow, we can turn young people into old people really fast. Let's see, could we turn older people into younger people? And so we ran another study, and this time we said, I want you to imagine you just received a phone call from your physician who told you about a new medical advance that virtually ensures you'll live about 30 years longer than you expected in relatively good health. You've got 30 minutes free. Following 3 people are available to you. Who do you choose? Are older people choosing to spend time with their families? No. In this study, there were fewer of them who chose a member of their immediate family than younger people did. So now they were picking choices. They were pursuing goals to expand their horizons, to learn, to explore. It was a function of time. As I say, we ran scores of these kinds of studies. We ran them in different countries, different cultures, and we had similar kinds of findings. Whether we were in Taiwan or Beijing or the United States, Hong Kong, we still saw the same kinds of responses in Germany and other parts of Europe. But still, they were hypothetical situations. We were asking people, imagine this, and asking them to give us a response, and that's not terribly satisfying. But we had given people these kinds of options for so long, over so many years, that we had data collected, sadly, before a number of natural disasters, like 9/11. So we had collected a lot of data. We knew we had these age differences. 9/11 occurs. And it primes a sense of fragility of life. It primes a sense of mortality in life. And what we saw for 6 months after 9/11 is that younger people's choices were the same as older people's choices. They wanted to focus on people who they cared most about. They wanted to spend time with people they loved and who they felt close to. Sometimes we saw this even with political events. When Hong Kong was returned to the People's Republic of China, there was a lot of media attention prior to the handover about the end of Hong Kong. And Helene Fung, who was from Hong Kong and a graduate student in my lab at the time, would come in and show me all these political cartoons, and we said, they're inducing an ending of Hong Kong. And we found the same thing, that for 6 months after the handover and shortly before the handover, we saw people, younger people, making the same kinds of choices, showing the same preferences as older people were showing. So we think that we were able to show that there was something important in people's goals and people's preferences that changed as a function of time horizons. We ran a study in the 90s with a group of gay men where one subsample was HIV negative, one was HIV positive but asymptomatic, and one HIV positive and symptomatic. They were all the same age. And we saw the same kinds of trends where the choices they were pursuing shifted to look like young, middle-aged, and older males. But they were actually the same chronological age. They had different life expectancies. They were anticipating different lengths of their futures. Now, social networks, as I mentioned, get smaller as people grow older. And there's been a lot of concern about that in gerontology, for the reason I mentioned a few minutes ago. That is, we assume people need other people, and so if you're not interacting as much, if your network is smaller, that's probably putting people at risk. But then we were seeing these findings about improved mental health. And so social networks until then had really been studied as an overall, how many friends do you have? How many people are in your network? And we thought maybe we should break them down into different types of social partners. And what you see here are findings from that same experience sampling study that I described to you, but in this case what you're seeing are the social network size for people of different ages from 20 into their 90s, but the color of these lines identifies a different type of social partner. And so what we see in the red line, this is the overall size of the network, and you clearly see it getting smaller as a function of age. The blue line are people who are named as members of the network but not very close. And then there are people who are in the network and close, and we see no decline in the size of that network. And in fact, in subsequent studies that we've done, it looks like instead of people simply being the hapless victims of constraining, reducing social networks, is that people are pruning their social networks over time, such that they're keeping those people in the network who they care about, who are meaningful to them, and letting go of other types of relationships. But it looks like it's more voluntary than simply reactive. So far, I've been talking about these changes in preferences, changes in goals, and how they may relate to social networks and social interactions. With Helene Fung, then a graduate student at the time and working on her dissertation, we began to have conversations about goals directing cognitive resources. So, human brains don't operate like computers. We don't take in all information in our environments evenly, but rather we see and hear and attend to stimuli in our environment that are goal relevant. So if you were walking across campus trying to find this room, you might walk right by a friend. But if you were walking across campus looking for your friend, you might have walked right by this room. So we see what's related to the goals that we're pursuing. And we started to think about some of the findings about older adults remembering more poorly than younger adults, and thought, in cognitive aging research, people tend to go to great efforts, for good reason, let me say, to have people look at and remember stimuli that are completely neutral, because you don't want to have stimuli, most people think in these studies, that would have meaning for one person that might be different for another. And so sometimes researchers will even make up nonsense words and ask younger and older people to remember. Older people do much more poorly on those tasks than younger people do. I think actually the interesting finding here on memory is that young people will remember anything you ask them to. It's really interesting. That's the more remarkable, I think, finding here. But older people usually don't perform as well on memory tasks as younger people do. So here's what we did. We thought, if goals are changing with age, and they are, then maybe people remember different types of information, and perhaps a lot of the studies that we design and test memory in are putting older people at a disadvantage. And so we worked with an advertising agency to develop pairs of advertisements that were identical except for the slogans. So what you see here is an advertisement for a camera, and it's Arnold camera. You see the photographs, and it says, "Capture the unexplored world." So there's one advertisement. And here's the other in that pair, exactly the same, except the slogan says, "Capture those special moments." So one is about an emotional reward, and one is about a learning reward. Okay, an exploration-related reward. Here's another example, a watch. "Successes within reach, don't let time pass you by. And take time for the ones you love. Don't let time pass you by." So the ads are the same, the slogans are different, and marketers, by the way, of course, we're just completely copying what marketers have known for probably centuries. If you want to sell a product, you find out what people's goals are, and you say, this product's going to help you realize your goals. So, turns out, older people remember the emotional slogans better than the neutral and the expansive slogans, and they remember the products that they feature better when they're framed as providing emotional rewards. So this started to get us quite interested in ways in which goal changes might affect cognitive processing. And Mara Mather, who's now a professor at USC, arrived in my lab one year as a postdoc, having worked with Marcia Johnson at Yale, and she's a distinguished cognitive aging researcher, and they were interested in something called choice supportive memory. It turns out that older people tend to remember decisions they've made more positively than younger people remember the decisions they made. And so she came to the laboratory, again, thinking about how preferences and goals might affect this. And I remember sitting around with her and also a former student, Susan Charles, who's now a professor at UC Irvine, and the three of us were talking about memory for meaningful information versus neutral or learning information. And we began to think about emotion, and we thought, I wonder if you see this preference for all kinds of emotion, positive or negative, or just positive. As it could be that paying attention to positive information makes you feel good, but it could be that paying attention to negative information allows you to, sort of navigate the minefields of life. But would we see differences in the emotional valence of the kind of information that people remember? To give you the punchline here, this is now called the positivity effect. There are about 100 studies. There was a recent meta-analysis published showing that older people and not younger people attend to and remember positive information far better than negative information. Let me show you some findings. So in one of the first ones that we ran, we collected images. Some of you will be familiar with these images. They're called IAPS images, the International Affective Picture Set. And they've all been validated for being positive or negative. And what we did was to have people, young, middle-aged, and older people, come into the laboratory, sit before a computer screen, and just look at these images. They were presented, you see 4 here, these were presented one at a time. So they would just scroll through the different images, look at the images as they chose. We did not tell them this was a memory test. After they were done, we said, so this is an incidental memory paradigm, we said, remember those images that you just reviewed? Tell us all the ones that you remember. And then we looked at the numbers remembered by young people, by middle-aged people, and by older people, and this is what we found. So let me first show you, these are the neutral images, and what you can see is regardless of age, people don't remember the neutral ones as well as the emotional ones. Older people especially don't remember the neutral images. If you look at in the younger adults, they're remembering pretty much equal numbers of positive and negative images. Already in our middle-aged group, we saw what we're calling this positivity effect emerge. That is, they're remembering more of the positive than the negative images. And in older people, we see this as a whopping effect, where they're remembering the positive images and they're not remembering the negative images. Now, this was the first study we ran that really identified this effect. And we didn't know if it was attention or it was recall. Was this memory, or was that they didn't attend to them and encode the information to begin with? So we ran almost the exact same study, but this time we collaborated with John Gabrielli, a neuroscientist, and people reviewed the images while they were in a brain scanner. So we could look at activation in the amygdala as they looked at the images. And what we saw there is that older people's brains, amygdala, regions of the brain, activated in response to the positive images, but not the negative images. They weren't being stored. Now, many people talk about the amygdala as being an emotion region of the brain, but others will call it a salience indicator. It's the region of the brain that says that's important, that's not important, which of course corresponds to emotion. But we think that older people aren't finding the negative information as informative, as interesting, as alluring as younger people are. So we thought maybe this had something to do with attention. We decided to run another study that's called a dot probe paradigm. Some of you may be familiar with this experimental paradigm. It's widely used to study different kinds of things. What we do is to ask people to come into the laboratory and look at a computer screen, and on the computer screen there will be 2 photographs. One is always someone a neutral face, and then posing an emotion face. And it's always the same person, and there's always one neutral face. And what happens in this paradigm is that the faces appear for a second, and then they disappear, and a dot appears behind one of those faces. And the task of the participant is simply to hit a key on the keyboard to the right or to the left, depending on where the dot appears on the screen. It's a great paradigm for studying aging because accuracy is essentially 100%. This is not a hard task. But the dependent variable is the speed with which people identify where that dot is. Because if they're already looking at the neutral face, they're going to be faster hitting that key than if they were looking at the smiling face, and vice versa. So it tells us where people's attention was oriented when they have 2 stimuli, and one is positive and one is neutral, or one is negative and one is neutral. So this is what it's like. A cross appears. We ask people to attend to the cross to get them to look at the center of the screen. Faces appear 1 second, they disappear, the dots. Okay? Again, this is what it's like. You look at the cross, faces appear, disappear. Now you would hit the key on the right side of the keyboard. Okay? What we see here is that for younger people, there are essentially no differences in the speed of responding when those neutral faces are paired with negative images than positive images. So they're just as fast. But for older people, they're faster to respond to where that dot is when it's behind the positive face, the happy face, and they're slower to respond when it's behind the unhappy face. So it looks like older people are being drawn to positive and looking away, disattending to negative. As I say, we and now many other laboratories have done a lot of studies examining the positivity effect, and it does appear to be reliable in many different kinds of paradigms, whether it's autobiographical memory, whether it's hearing, whether it's memory for decisions, and so on. So they've been used a lot of different paradigms and a lot of different laboratories, and it looks to be highly reliable. So as you can tell, I think these findings are pretty cool. And at Stanford, at the Center on Longevity that I direct, it's wildly interdisciplinary. So I hang out with biologists and economists and physicians and pediatricians and geriatricians. And one friend of mine who's especially, he's an especially good friend, Alan Garber is his name, he's a health economist, because he's the kind of friend who will both be happy for you but also criticize your work. You know, those are really important friends to have. So we're having lunch one day, and I'm talking to him about the positivity effect. And I'm telling him about this study and that study, and you see it here and you see it there. And he said, that's great. And really, he was interested. And then he sat back and he said, so now, he goes, Laura, make me care. And I thought, what? And he said, what difference does it make? Like, why does this matter? Economists are really good at asking those kinds of questions. And so we ran a study, and it was a study based on money, and we got him interested in that one. This was a study that we did with Brian Knudsen, another colleague of mine at Stanford, where we had people play or participate in a study where we used the monetary incentive delay task. And this is a task where we scan people's brains as they're winning and losing money. And the finding from this study is that when older people anticipate losing money, you don't see much brain activation. When younger people anticipate losing money, you see a lot of it. When older people anticipate winning money, activation's there, but not for losing money. It's really interesting that we see these differences even in financial settings. We began to do some work on the prevention of financial fraud, and that maybe, in some cases, this positivity effect, while it may be good for mood and well-being, could put people at risk for making bad decisions. And then we began to think about ways that we could also use this kind of information to try to improve the health and well-being of people. We know that Americans are physically inactive. We don't walk enough. And we also know that walking, exercise, you heard it here, is the best thing you can do to age well. Physically, cognitively, emotionally, exercise, exercise, exercise. That's the best news I can give you about aging well. So we thought, could we use this information to get older people to walk more, to exercise more? And Nana Nothoff, a then graduate student of mine who's now a professor in Germany, ran this study as part of her dissertation. And what we did was to recruit older people to participate in a study. We give them a pedometer, and during the week, they're randomly assigned to one of two groups, and they both receive messages about the importance of walking throughout the week while they have the pedometer. One group is receiving positive information about walking. If you walk, it builds your bones. If you walk, it reduces your likelihood of falling. If you walk, and it was all good news. And in the other group, we gave them bad news. If you don't walk, you lose your balance, there's muscle wasting. So we would give them information. It was the same information, but it was framed as bad news, framed as good news. And this is what we see in the walking study, where the green line is showing you steps walked over a 30-day period. When we give older people positive information about walking, walking goes up. Negative information had no effect in the study. There was really no change at all in walking. And we just finished another study, not yet published, but I'll leave you with this one. Again, it was a study designed to encourage people using financial incentives to walk more. So the way that this study works, we have young, middle-aged, and older people. They come into the laboratory, we give them a pedometer, ask them to walk for a week, and that's their baseline. They come back to the laboratory, and when they come back after the week, we randomly assign them to one of about 4 different conditions, and they can earn more money by walking more than their baseline. I think it's a nickel they get for every step they walk over what they walked in week 1. So we get the baseline, now we say, now walk more. And in one condition, we say, we'll give you the money. Every step you walk, you're gonna make the money. We're gonna write you a check next time you come back. And in another condition, we say, you tell us a charity, an organization you wanna give money to, we'll write a check and we'll give it to that charity. So walk more for the charity. So it's for social good versus for oneself. And this is what we find. Older people walk, and younger people walk more when they can make money for themselves. For a charity, older people still walk more, significantly more over baseline. And younger people, not a step. I mean, there was like nothing more for a charity. But older people were engaging and walking when it was meaningful. It was for a cause they cared about. And there we could also activate this increase in an important health behavior. Longevity is not about the elderly. Longevity is about living a long time, preparing for a long life, and making sure that the kinds of lives that you're living today are ones that are going to take you to satisfying, healthy, secure places in the future. What we need to begin to do now more than ever in human history is to rethink a kind of a culture that can support us all the way through century-long lives. Thanks for listening to me today. Thank you.
We have a few moments if anybody has some questions for Dr. Carstensen. We can answer some questions.
Tell them about those asterisks on the last slide.
Oh, at the significance level. So it's just statistically significant, and the other bar was not. Mm-hmm. By the way, we see significant effects in that. So the kinds of people are walking, at least, it varies by condition, but at least 2,000 steps a day more in the incentive conditions. And that's a mile more a day. And that clearly in the literature on health and fitness is enough to have a real impact clinically on one's health. So we were pleased. It wasn't just a statistically significant effect, but it was a clinically significant effect. Thanks. Yes. Mm-hmm. So this was a study where people were in a brain scanner and seeing those images, right? So generally when people view an emotional stimuli, you see activation in the amygdala. And that's the region of the brain that's involved in encoding emotion memories. And what we saw there was activation, just as you see in younger people, to the positive images, but there wasn't virtually no activation in response to the negative images, which suggested that older people weren't even encoding the information. They weren't remembering. It wasn't being laid down into long-term memory. Does that answer your question? Thanks. Yes.
Hello? Can you hear me? Okay, so in one of the question you mentioned that when time is short, people will prefer to spend time with the loved ones when the horizons is longer, they plan to meet with new people. Did you investigate why do they want to spend time with loved ones? Is it because they're afraid of missing an opportunity, the motivation of spending more time with the loved ones?
Well, we think what a loved one represents is an emotional, meaningful activity. So it's a choice. It's telling us what their preference is at the time. Do they want to feel good? Do they want to learn? For most people, members of our immediate families are not terribly information rich, which in part makes us love them because you can just be with them and it's not a test, right? But what we get from those is satisfaction and a sense of meaning and positive emotional experience. When we interact with other types of social partners, we think other kinds of goals are realized. So that's why we use those different types of partners to represent goals. When we first started this line of research and we wanted some empirical evidence that goals really are different as a function of time. But it's really hard to ask humans what their goals are. Right? I could ask you all in this room, what's your goal? Why are you here? What's your goal? And some of you would say learning, and some of you would say being with my friend, and some of you would say, well, I really want my professors to see that I'm here. There are all different kinds of reasons for that. But people aren't very good reporters of those kinds of goals. But we thought the preference approach is used a lot by economists to try to understand what people really want. They say, which one? Tell us which one you prefer. You prefer blue or yellow? And that tells us something about what their inherent goals are and preferences. Thank you. Yes?
So you used age, and I'm wondering, have you thought about or have you looked at factoring in race and ethnicity or disaggregating it from some of the data that you do have?
Yeah, we have, in virtually all the studies that we've run over the years that are funded by my National Institute on Aging grant, we, in those studies, oversample African Americans and include European Americans as the comparison group. When we first started this work, we were going to try to include all ethnicities in the Bay Area, and unfortunately what you get is an N of 1, for 50. So you can't really make heads or tails out of that. And it drives me crazy when people say, well, there are white people, and then we're going to put all minority groups in one group. And it's like, hello? So instead we thought we would do better to just focus on two groups. So in most of the studies I talked about, we have African Americans and European Americans. Now that said, we've done a lot of work, and it's really thanks to Helene Fung, who was a graduate student and had access to data collection in Asia. And she has continued to work in this area as a professor at the University of Hong Kong. So she's still doing this kind of work there. And we see the same kinds of effects in Asian cultures. And we went there, it was really one of the first other countries we went to because we thought it may be that in Asian cultures, because of a preference for preference isn't the right word, because of an honoring and a valuing of family, that we wouldn't see any age differences, that young or old would still be saying this. You see the same kind of age differences in Hong Kong, Beijing, and Taiwan anyway. So yes, it's a great question. People also ask about gender differences. And in the emotion realm, what we see is a main effect of gender that you would expect, but no gender-age interactions. So women experience more emotions, positive and negative, than men across the age. But it's not that this isn't happening for men. Men are also showing the same kinds of trends with age. So we're seeing the same kinds of positive trends in well-being for men and for women. Great question. Thank you. Yeah. Yes.
What would you say the happiest time of your life is at what age?
60.
60?
Okay. It's between 60 and 65, according to our data and some other data as well from other studies, very different kinds of studies. And it doesn't go down after that, by the way, it just levels. But that looks like it's about, that looks like it might be the peak. Yeah. And of course, I'm kind of joking half-heartedly. I can't tell you for you, but if you look at these kinds of graphs, and we see it in multiple studies, it looks like it would be the 60s to the 70s that you'd see it peak.
how does that interact with the retirement age? Are people happy because they get to stop working?
No,
or do other things?
no, good question, but no. That was one of the first things we thought, right, yeah, sure, right, not to work anymore. Retirement shows very little effect one way or another. Occasionally you'll see a study saying that emotional experience is worse after retirement. Sometimes one will find that it's better. They tend to be small samples. If you look across the literature on retirement, there's no effect of retirement on emotional well-being, not positive, not negative. Do I understand your question? I just want to make sure I'm hearing right. You said, do we understand the social pressures people go through with life? Not terribly well, but yes, there are a couple things I can say about that. One is that related to time. I think, again, I was saying earlier, people tell you all the time, your age, these are the best years of your life. I think what people don't understand, especially older people, because of the positivity effects. So we look back when we were young, we go, oh, that was great. And we've forgotten all the bad times. We're just remembering the good times, right? But it's actually when your future is long and uncertain, as it typically is in early adulthood, and when you know that anything can happen, and people often say, isn't that great? Anything can happen. You kind of go, oh, I don't know. It's anxiety producing that anything could happen. And so there are all these kinds of ifs and what ifs. Am I going to find my soulmate? Am I going to get married? Am I going to have children? Am I going to like my work? Am I going to get into graduate school? On and on, and it's all these what ifs. And humans don't deal with those what ifs very well. And what's interesting is that we as humans, as a species, we're pretty good at dealing with the hand we've been dealt. You didn't get the job, people recover. You get an illness, people recover emotionally. You hear the thing about the lottery. You win the lottery, people think they're going to be happy forever. No, they actually recover and go right back to where they were. So we adjust emotionally to the certainties we have in life, good or bad. But what's really hard for humans is this kind of, maybe, it's waiting for something to happen or not. And I think that's why we're seeing very high rates of depression and anxiety in young people, in part because your futures are getting longer than ever, And so it creates uncertainty, and that creates anxiety. It's not all bad. There's great things, about knowing that anything can happen, but uncertainty is hard for humans. That's what I would say. When people get older, even though the futures are shorter, they're more certain. I bet, I know I could win this bet in this room. If I said to you, I want you to predict what your lives will be like 5 years from now. How certain are you? 1 to 10. I don't think you're terribly certain. Not as certain as I am, but I think my life's going to be pretty much the same 5 years from now as it is now. And I think, on the one hand, people can go, oh, that's terrible. I think we sort of think of that kind of consistency, but it's actually really good emotionally to know kind of where things are and what the future will be like. And it's hard not to know. So that's what I think. Is that helpful?
You had mentioned about dementia and how early signs are showing. Is that more related to saying it's no longer believed to be age-related?
Oh, no. Dementia is age-related. What is changing in our understanding of dementia is that there's now pretty compelling evidence that long before people show symptoms, real symptoms, they can't remember something, they're wandering, they're getting lost, that decades before that, they're showing milder signs of some kind of cognitive decline. And so it looks like it starts very early and is probably a very slowly progressing illness. And we just don't see the frank symptoms until much later in life. That's what most people are thinking these days about dementia.
Okay, so I think we have time for one last question.
So one of the questions, all of this is tied to aging, right? The responses that people have. But I was wondering if let's say all of us, like younger people, we have like an older person mentality. Does that mean that we experience things as an older person, or how much?
If you have an older person as, what was the, I just didn't hear.
If you have a mentality of an older person, even though
like
you're
an
young.
old soul.
Yeah. How does that affect all of these responses and the mystery myth and everything?
That's a great, wonderful question. I don't know the answer. Except there is some evidence that when younger people are close to older people, they have a lot of people in their lives, grandparents, older friends, relatives, uncles, aunts, that they tend to be able to be in that state more easily than younger people. Just living in the present, being in the moment. And so there is some evidence that having familiarity with old age does that. You know, the other thing, I'm going to just leave you with this, is this is just pure speculation on my part, but you know there is this view that older people and children, little children, have a natural kind of affinity for one another. I think that's because they really can live in the present, just purely in the present, and people in the middle of life can't. Raise your hand if there was anybody in this room who didn't think sometime during the past hour about what you're going to go do next. We got one foot out the door. You know, we're always in the next thing, what we need to do. And young children can just be in a moment. And so can older people. And I think that might be what binds them. So, thank you. Thank you all.
So we have a reception in the back of the room. If people need to get stamps for your class, you can get that in the corner of the room. Thank you, everybody, for coming out. Enjoy yourself.